Okay. World War One, Section 2, getting what America's going to do to prepare for the war. The next person that speaks without raising their hand, miss that, don't you? I miss saying it to you guys every day. Hope y'all are having a good time, staying safe. All right, this is Section 2, and you need to watch it, listen to it, take some notes on it, and there'll be other things coming your way probably on Monday. So anyway, this is Section 2. Americans prepare for war. You know, we talked in the last section about how World War II got started with the Germans and their U-boats and Franz Ferdinand getting assassinated and the Lusitania being sunk by the Germans with American people on it. Well, the Zimmerman note, we mentioned that, how that when Germany tried to influence Mexico to join in and attack the United States from the south, down there around Texas and those places, said they would give that back to them at the end of the war after they won the war. Of course, they didn't win it, but they expected they would, because you don't go into something thinking you're not going to do well at it. So they thought they were going to win. But that Zimmerman note, along with the sinking of the Lusitania, is what got us into the war. We had tried to remain neutral, but our ships were carrying lots of supplies to the Allies. And of course, this upset Germany. So they started the unrestricted submarine warfare. And so with the sinking of the Lusitania, and then with the Zimmerman note, we decide President Wilson, who was our president during this time, goes to Congress and asks for permission to declare war. Because according to our Constitution, the president can't just declare war, he has to get permission from Congress to do that. So now we've decided we're going into the war, so we have to have people. And so we start this program called the Selective Service Act. In this act, if you were between 21 and 30, you had to register for the draft. We had 3 million people sign up. So obviously, people volunteered, people got drafted, but we had plenty of people ready to go to the war. During World War I, 400,000 African Americans got involved in the war. Very often they didn't get to, the 369th got into a lot of fighting and won some awards. But for the most part, the black soldiers, this was during the time of Jim Crow that we've talked about a lot this year. They were considered inferior. They were considered not able to do stuff. But in these war efforts, they were got some recognition, got some good things going their way. During war, sometimes you lose some of your freedoms. And of course you don't want to, but there was a Supreme Court case. You can read about it on page 727 in your book. That was a big deal. It went to the Supreme Court. It was called Schneck versus United States, and it said that during time of war and other other types of disasters, kind of like what we're going on now while we're not in school, and I'm sitting here talking into a stupid telephone instead of sitting there looking at you, because of this virus that's going around, the government gets a little more power than it would ordinarily have, and this came about because of this Schneck versus the United States back at the end of World War I. So the government can do things during, that don't seem right, that don't seem constitutional. Any other time they have the power to do this, according to this Supreme Court case. They had passed the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, which said if you were caught spying on the United States, or if you spoke out against the United States, you could be put in prison, you could be fined, all these kind of things like this. And the Schneck guy took this to court because he said, "You're denying me my freedom of speech." And of course, as I just said, the case said that you could do that. You could deny certain freedoms during time of war like that. We needed to get money to buy the things that we needed for the war effort, and so they started Liberty Bonds. And what this was is it was basically a citizen making a loan to the government, knowing that in the future they would get their money back plus interest. That was called Liberty Bonds. You had famous people during the time period going around and making speeches, encouraging people to buy these bonds to support the war effort. The American people really got involved in the war once we got into it, and even though they'd been reluctant at the beginning to get into it, some of them might, if they were of German descent, they might say, well, I don't want to fight Germany. Grandpa and Grandma are still over there because they maybe came as immigrants, and so. But once we got into the war, we got into it strong, and so trying to get people to buy Liberty Bonds. Other organizations were set up by the government to establish efforts to make the war go well. The War Industries Board, it oversaw the production of steel and copper, cement, rubber, things like that were needed for the war effort. That was its job, is to see that these things were taken care of. Another thing was the Food Administration was started, and of course that was to increase food supplies to get food to the soldiers in war. Even people started planting victory gardens here in America, having a little garden. Maybe someone who never had a garden before, but now they're going to have one, so that they can say that they're helping the war effort by having a garden. They would have days called, for example, Meatless Monday. Days like that where they would people wouldn't eat any kind of meat. They were saving that for the soldiers to be sent overseas. They would have sugarless days, wheatless days, just different things. And as I mentioned a minute ago, they would even raise their own garden, which was called victory gardens. During the war, opportunities came up for people who hadn't had opportunities in the past to be able to, for example, women. Here the men have gone off to war. You still needed to make weapons and uniforms and all these kind of things. And so somebody had to do that. And there were three situations that led to the shortage of labor force during the war. First was the weapons and supplies had to be made, like I say, for the soldiers to fight and have a chance to win. And so we didn't have enough workers for that because of the soldiers being drafted. As I said a minute ago, 4 million were drafted to go into the Army during this time. Before, we'd always had plenty of immigrants to come and do jobs, and once the war started, most immigrants weren't allowed to come anymore, so we weren't getting a new groups of immigrants in, but so we're having a shortage of labor there. And of course, most of the young men of fighting age, we said the draft was 21 to 30, most of the men of fighting age were already involved in the Army in one way or another, so we had a labor shortage. And because of that, this opened up opportunities for women. During this time in our history, most of the time women had stayed home. They hadn't worked outside the home. And so here came opportunities that they hadn't had in the past to go and work in these factories where men had always worked. So this was a new opportunity for women. Your book said that some 1 million women joined the U.S. workforce during the war years. And for most of them, that's the first time they'd ever even thought about working outside their home. Always in the past, they had worked at home, being mom, raising kids, fixing the meals, the laundry, that type of stuff. And so for a lot of these, this was an exciting time to get to do things that they had never done before. Plus, again, it just showed the concern and the effort that Americans had for that war to go and win that war. And matter of fact, when President Wilson was campaigning in 1916 to run for his second term, he campaigned on make the world safe for democracy. And so people were really caught up in this war effort during this time. So this gave women lots of opportunities to do things that they hadn't done in the past. And so this was a big change during that time. Your book said that about 25,000 American women volunteered as nurses, telephone operators, signalers, typists, and interpreters in France. So not only were they working outside the home, some of them were leaving home. They were going to Europe to participate in the war. And so that was just a big time, as far as things changing for the women during this time. That was a really big deal. Your book has a quote from a woman. You did an assignment where you looked up a diary of a soldier. Well, this woman kept a diary, and here's what she said. She was a driver, an ambulance driver. So when they would get somebody wounded, they would carry him to the ambulance, put him on there, and take him to the nearest facility where they could get care. And here's what she says. I'm reading this on page 728. It says, "We had our first air raid work last night. I was the night driver on duty. Some bombs fell very near just as I got to the hospital. When shrapnel," y'all know what shrapnel is, right? Pieces of metal and stuff. When shrapnel whizzed past my head, and there was a tremendous crash close beside. Then an ambulance came, and I tore off." So anyway, this is what this woman experienced. You probably never in her life had she had pieces of metal flying by her head. So it was it was some big efforts on these people's parts. But you had women, just like you had other people during the war effort, who were against the war. They didn't think we should be fighting in this war overseas. They wanted us to stay isolated and stay neutral. And you had a woman named Jeanette Rankin. She was the first woman ever elected to Congress. She was from Montana, where they had allowed women to vote back in the 1880s. They still couldn't vote all over the United States yet. That doesn't happen until 1920. But she had been involved in politics in Montana, and she was the first woman in the House of Representatives. And she did vote no against the war and said that she didn't think that was a good thing. Earlier in another chapter, we talked about Jane Addams. She was the one who helped to build these tenement houses for the immigrants as they were coming over in the 1880s and 90s. She spoke out against the war, saying that we shouldn't be involved in it, that we should stay here in our place and not get involved in stuff going on overseas. But as you know, we do get involved and we do well. Matter of fact, once we get there, the war's over in just around a year. It had been going on for 3 years before, but we'll talk more about that later. Also during the war, having to do with labor, getting people to work in these factories to make all these things that were needed for the war. You had other groups, and we talked about women just a minute ago doing things they hadn't done before. You had Mexican Americans come from out west, moving to these industrial cities, particularly in the north. A lot of them was where a lot of them were. Of course, there were some in California as well, but they got opportunities they hadn't had. They'd always been fruit pickers and those kind of jobs, because that's what they did. But they get opportunities that they hadn't had before. Of course, you have blacks moving from the south to the north, because in the South, because of the Jim Crow laws, as you know, they couldn't get jobs and stuff. So by moving north, they could get in these factories. But once they got there, they still faced discrimination because these white people in the north, oh, well, I don't want a black person coming to take my job. And so there's some riots and things that broke out. It's not in your book, but at one point during World War I, this black teenage boy was swimming in whatever that Great Lake is by Chicago. I can't think of it right now. Is it Lake Michigan, I think? But anyway, he was swimming, and they had the beaches and the area marked off, blacks only, whites only. And he happened to get into he's swimming. He didn't have anywhere it was. He gets onto the white side, and they start throwing rocks at him, and he drowns. So I mean, that's sad stuff. But this is kind of stuff that was going on sometimes during this time of Jim Crow. And even in the north, like I say, when the black people moved there it's called the Great Migration, they faced this kind of discrimination, but it wasn't as bad as it was in the South at that time. But still, they did face discrimination as well. One of the last things we'll talk about for a minute was the National War Labor Board. President Wilson sets this up. And it's to try to keep workers and management from having strikes and keep the people working where they need to be. And your book said that the board settled more than 1,000 labor disputes. So that was good. So the people could stay in the factories and do what they needed to do to get the war effort going. Okay, that's all I want to cover on section 2. Now I will be getting you. Sending it out to you quizzes and some of the worksheets and things that we've done in the past. So be looking for those. You can answer on the sheet and then upload it and then email it back to me, and I can be able to grade them and all that sort of stuff like that. If you haven't got all this week's work sent in that I gave you, get all that done and get that turned in before it's too late, okay? Because we're still keeping all the grades of the work that you do, that sort of stuff. What do we have? Let's see, we have 2 more sections, and then we'll be having a test on this chapter sometime next week, and that will be sent to you, and you'll fill it out. And then you'll upload it. You'll download it when it comes from me. Then you'll upload it and send it to me so that I can grade it. Well, that's it. I hope you're staying safe out there. I hope you're doing some stuff that's fun, and hope you're learning. And be safe. Can't wait to see y'all again.